A freckled girl tugged the widow's coat. "Papa says we need a mama, will you?" There's a button in the breast pocket of my good shirt, the one Ellie sewed back on the morning before she died. I've never moved it. Not to another shirt, not to the tin box where I keep her thimble and her mother's ring. It stays in that pocket. I don't know why I'm telling you this except that the button is where all of it starts, in a way. The smallest, stupidest things are always where it starts. That was the winter of 1882, November already turning mean. I was standing at the dry goods counter in Calder Fork trying to remember whether we had coffee at home, and my daughter Nora, she was 6 then, 6.5 if you asked her, had hold of my coat and was tugging at it the way she always did when she wanted me to lean down. I leaned. I thought she was going to ask for one of those peppermint sticks in the jar by the register. She didn't ask for a peppermint stick. What she said I'll carry to my grave. She said it plain, the way children say the things that undo you, looking straight at me with those brown eyes that were her mother's eyes, every bit of them. "Papa, Mrs. Aldecoa gave us apple cake today and her house smelled like a real house. You know how our house smells." I knew how our house smelled. Smoke and leather and boots that needed resoling. The smell of a man doing his inadequate best. "Papa says we need a mama," Nora told me, straightening up now, turning, and I realized she wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to the woman standing behind me at the counter. "Will you?" I nearly put my elbow through a jar of molasses turning around. Her name was Ruth Calder. As in, yes, the town, her grandfather had platted it, named it for himself, and the Calders had been contracting and slowly moving away from it ever since, like a tide going out. By the time I met her, she was the last one. Her husband, Thomas, had died the spring before. Not dramatically. Pneumonia, same as half the county that year. He'd been a decent man by every account I heard, which was a lot of accounts because in a town of 412 souls everyone dies in public. Everyone knows the details. Everyone brings a dish and stands in your kitchen and tells you things about the man you already knew, and then they leave and the house is just you and the quiet and the shape of everything that's missing. She was maybe 35, dark-haired, already a few threads of gray at the temple that she didn't trouble to hide. Strong hands, I noticed that right away, the way you notice things that tell you something true about a person. Not soft-work hands, not town hands. She was carrying a bolt of canvas and a spool of copper wire, which is not what a woman buys when she's given up on her situation. That's what a woman buys when she's got something specific to fix, and she intends to fix it. She looked at Nora for a moment, and then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't decode right away. Not pity, not embarrassment, something closer to recognition, the look of a person who has seen something they understand from having been in the vicinity of it themselves. "I appreciate the offer," she said to Nora very seriously. "What's your name?" "Nora Greer. My papa is Emmett Greer. He has a ranch." "I know," Ruth said. "I know who your papa is." I had no idea how she knew who I was. I found out later. Everybody knew who I was, the way everybody in a small town knows the saddest story walking around in boots. The widower with the little girl and the place out on the Ash Creek flats that was going to slide into the creek before spring if somebody didn't reshingle the south roof. People had tried to help, early on. Mrs. Haskell had brought food 3 times, and I'd thanked her and sent her off each time with the container washed, and eventually she'd stopped, and I couldn't blame her for stopping. You can only offer a hand to a man who won't take it so many times before you decide he's made his choice. Nora reached out and took hold of Ruth's coat, the way she'd been taking hold of mine. Just the hem of it, 2 fingers, like she was anchoring herself. Like she didn't want the woman to move away before she'd gotten a fair look. Ruth looked down at those 2 fingers. Something moved across her face, quick, and then gone, the way things move across a person's face when they're managing themselves carefully. "We have to get back," I said. My voice came out strange, rougher than I meant. I put my hand on Nora's shoulder and steered her toward the door, and I forgot whatever I'd come in for, coffee or no coffee. I just needed to be outside in the cold air where nothing was looking at me. I didn't look back. The ranch was 380 acres of decent grassland and rocks, the creek cutting through the south pasture, a stand of cottonwoods along the north fence that were pretty in the fall and useless every other season. I'd built the house myself, 1875, the year Ellie and I came out from Missouri with 2 horses, a wagon, $400, and the particular arrogance of 2 people who think they know what they're doing. 2 rooms then. Added a 3rd when Nora came. Added a linta when I needed somewhere to put the despair that didn't fit in the 3 rooms. It's hard to describe what that winter was, the winter of '82, if you haven't lived the particular quiet of a house where the woman who held it together is 2 years gone. 2 years sounds like enough time. People will tell you 2 years is enough time. 2 years is nothing. 2 years is finding her handwriting on a scrap of paper tucked in a coat pocket. She was always writing things down, reminders and lists, the small record-keeping of a life, and having to sit down for 10 minutes before you can stand back up. I had Nora. She was the whole thing, really. The only thing. I got up in the morning because she needed breakfast. I kept the fire because she needed to be warm. I walked her to school and I was there when she came home and I fed her and I answered her questions. I told myself that was enough, that it was enough to just be needed in that basic animal way, wood and food and a roof. And some days I could make myself believe it, and most days I could not. She was a cheerful child, Nora was. That surprised people sometimes. They'd expect to see a sad little girl, motherless, living with a quiet, damaged man out on the flats, and instead they'd get this talkative, freckled, relentlessly curious creature who had opinions about everything from the best way to cross a muddy creek to the fairness of Mrs. Aldecoa's reading assignments. She'd gotten the cheerfulness from Ellie. The stubbornness she'd gotten from me, though I didn't like to say so. The directness, I don't know exactly where the directness came from. Some combination of them both, maybe. The kind of thing that happens when 2 particular people make a 3rd person together. I was grateful for her cheerfulness. It held the house up in ways I couldn't. She would come in from school with her report of the day, all of it, every event in sequence with commentary, and I would listen and the house would be full of her voice, and it was enough to get through the evening. Then she'd go to sleep and the house would go quiet and I would sit by the fire, and the quiet had a particular quality to it in those months. Not peaceful, not restful. The kind of quiet that is the absence of something specific, the shape of what's missing pressed into the silence. But here is what I couldn't give her. I could not give her the smell of apple cake. I could not give her a house that smelled like a real house. I could not explain to a 6-year-old why her father moved through rooms like a man moving through chest-deep water, slow and deliberate, and using everything he had just to keep upright. I could barely explain it to myself. There's a kind of grief that doesn't look like grief from the outside after a while. From the outside I was doing all right. I was keeping the ranch running, keeping Nora fed and dressed and in school. I was civil enough in town when I had cause to be in town. I was getting through the days. That looks like functioning. And it is functioning in the same way that a man with a broken leg who has learned to walk on it is ambulatory. He gets from here to there. You wouldn't necessarily know, watching him, that something was still wrong inside. Calder Fork had a circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks, and a schoolhouse that Mrs. Aldecoa ran out of what had been the old freight office. 8 kids in the winter, sometimes 9, depending on who was needed on their family's place. Nora walked the 2 miles every day except when the weather was truly murderous, and I walked with her in the mornings or rode alongside when I had to get to town anyway. It was the best part of my days for a while, that morning walk. She was a talker. She would tell me everything, the texture of the previous day at school, the disagreements and the games and the specific ways different children had behaved, all of it delivered in her rapid, precise way, and I would listen and respond. And for that 40 minutes of walking, I was entirely present in a way I often wasn't otherwise. It was on one of those walks, maybe 3 weeks after the dry goods incident, early December now. the cold having made up its mind about the direction of things, that I saw Ruth Calder's wagon coming the other way on the Ash Creek Road. She pulled up. You do that on a country road in winter. You don't pass a neighbor without pulling up. "Mr. Greer," she said. "Mrs. Calder." Nora said, "Hello," very brightly, and then stood there radiating expectation the way only children can, like a small determined stove. Ruth was hauling something in the wagon bed. Lumber. Good pine planks, new cut, still pale and resinous smelling. You could catch it on the cold air. I looked at the lumber and she looked at me looking at it and said, "I'm fixing the parlor floor. 3 boards went soft over the summer." "You're doing it yourself." "I've been doing things myself for a while now." I didn't have an answer for that. She was a widow and I was a widower, and we were standing in the same December on the same road, and we had both, in our different ways, been doing things ourselves for a while now. We were even. Or we were in the same condition, which is different from being even. "I heard your south roof," she said. "What about my south roof?" "That it needs work before the snow loads up on it." "Heard from who?" She just looked at me, which meant from Pete Haskell, most likely, who was my neighbor to the north and the biggest gossip on the Ash Creek Road, which he would tell you himself and see nothing wrong with it. "It's on my list," I said. She said. I didn't like that. It had information in it. It had the sound of a woman who has a very specific picture of how long something has been on a list. She clucked to her horse and went on down the road, and Nora watched her go with that expression I'd come to dread a little, the one that said she was computing something she didn't have words for yet, and was prepared to be patient about arriving at them. "Papa," she said. "Don't," I said. She didn't, but she looked at me sideways for the rest of the walk, which was almost worse. What I haven't told you yet is what that fall had actually been, the full picture. In September, I'd lost 11 head to a respiratory ailment that went through the herd fast and mean, the kind of sickness that moves through animals the way a fire moves through dry grass here, then everywhere, before you've figured out you have a problem. By October, I was looking at the books and seeing a number that had one of those silences around it, the kind that means you don't say it out loud because saying it makes it more real. I owed the bank in Hallbrook $40 I couldn't pay until spring if the calves came in strong, and calves don't always come in strong. Weather happens. Sickness happens again. In ranching, you know all the ways a plan can come apart. I had a south roof that was, Ruth Calder was not wrong, in need of attention I hadn't given it. Every morning I looked at the south roof and thought about the south roof and added it to the list and went to do something else instead. I had a daughter who needed new boots and had been wearing boots half a size too small since August because I kept thinking I'd get to it. I had fence on the north pasture section that wanted 3 new posts, and a pump on the east well that made a sound it hadn't made the previous year. A sound that was a warning if you knew pumps well enough to know what it was warning of. None of these things individually would have done me in. Together, over weeks, they had the cumulative weight of a verdict. You are behind, you are always behind, you cannot catch up, you are losing ground. I was not a man who talked about these things. Ellie had been the one I talked to, not because I was too proud to say hard things out loud, or not only because of that, but because she had been the person who knew what to do with hard things. She could hold a problem and look at it and not panic, and when she looked at it that way it got smaller. She had a quality of steadiness that I had relied on more than I'd understood until it was gone. When she died, I lost the only person who made hard things smaller. So they stayed big, and I moved through them like a man in chest-deep water, because that's the only way I knew to move. My neighbor Pete Haskell had offered to help with the roof twice. I'd said no twice. That's the kind of fool I was that fall. The kind who says no to a neighbor's offered hand and then lies awake at 2 in the morning listening for the first sound of a board giving way under the weight of a hard night's snow. Pete was a good man. He and his wife Margaret had been our neighbors for 5 years, and they'd been as kind as people can be after Ellie died, and I'd taken the kindness for a while, the food and the company, and then I'd gradually pushed it back, not out of ingratitude but out of something I can only call withdrawal. A man who goes underwater doesn't necessarily want to be pulled out. Sometimes going under feels like the only honest thing. Like surfacing would be a kind of lie, a performance of being all right that would cost more than staying down. Pete had seen enough of that in me to stop pressing. He'd go on being a decent neighbor, the practical kind, and he'd leave me to it, and I was grateful for the being left to it even as the being left to it was slowly killing me. The south roof held through November, barely. The first Saturday of December, I went into town for the boots. I want you to understand the boots. This is not a minor detail. This is the whole situation in miniature. I had been looking at those boots on Nora's feet for 3 months, knowing they were wrong, knowing every day that they were wrong, telling myself next week it'll slow down, next week I'll get to town. The thing that finally got me off the ranch and into Calder Fork was not a decision I made so much as a kind of collapse of the excuses. I ran out of reasons to put it off. Which is how I did most things that winter. Not out of will, but out of the running out of resistance. Not moving toward anything so much as ceasing to hold back. I got the boots. Brown leather, good quality, the right size. The woman at the counter, Mrs. Finch, who had known Ellie since before we came out from Missouri, who had been at the funeral and had sent food twice in the first year, and had treated me with the careful kindness you give a man who is hanging on by his fingernails, wrapped them in brown paper and tied them with a string and said, "How are you holding up, Emmett?" And I said, "Fine," in the voice I used for that question, the voice that answered without opening a door. She looked at me the way Mrs. Finch always looked at me, with that careful sadness she'd never entirely learned to conceal, and I took the boots and went. I was at the hitching post, untying my horse, when I heard a sound from the alley beside the feed store. Not a loud sound. The particular controlled sound of someone working to keep a thing contained, a sound that has discipline in it but not quite enough. I didn't want to look. I tied a knot, untied it, tied it again. I had boots to get home and a horse standing there and no business whatever going into that alley. I went into the alley. Ruth Calder was sitting on a crate against the feed store wall with her face in her hands. Not weeping, or not just weeping. Something past weeping. The kind of crying that has run out of noise, just the shaking of it left, the residue of a thing after most of it has already been spent. Her shoulders moved with it, and she had her face fully covered the way you do when you want to be inside the dark for a minute. I stood at the mouth of the alley for a long moment. Everything reasonable in me said to turn around. She was a grown woman managing her private grief, and she didn't need a near stranger inserting himself into it. I had a horse and boots and no business standing there. I walked in anyway. I didn't say anything. I set the wrapped boots on the ground and leaned against the wall, not close, a few feet off, enough space that she knew I was there but wasn't crowded by me. Let her hear that someone had come without having to deal with who it was yet. After a while she looked up. Her face was blotched and raw, the skin around her eyes gone pink and swollen, and she didn't try to hide any of it, didn't duck her head or look away, which I respected more than I could have explained in the moment. "Go away," she said, but not hard. More like she was putting the words out there as a formality, something she felt was required of the situation. "Sure," I said. I didn't move. She looked at me for a moment, looked at me taking up the wall with my arms crossed and my hat in my hand. Then something in her seemed to give way, not to more grief, but to something else. Exhaustion, maybe. The kind of exhaustion I'd been living in and recognized on sight. "The bank," she said. "The bank in Hallbrook. Thomas left. There's a note on the house and the acreage. I've been current on it. I've done everything right. And they're telling me now that there's a provision, some provision in the original papers that Thomas signed that I wasn't told about, that lets them call it in if there's a change of. She stopped. Reorganized herself. I don't have $40. I heard the $40 like something physical, like the particular sound of a word that is also your exact situation, said out loud. Neither do I said. She stared at me. Not right now, I said. End of February maybe if the calves come right. We looked at each other in that cold alley for a moment, two people standing in the exact same water, and something passed between us that didn't have a name yet. Just recognition. The particular recognition of people who are both too proud and too tired and have found themselves sitting, in their different ways, on the same crate. I haven't cried since June, she said. She said it as if this were relevant information, which somehow it was. What happened in June? I found his good coat hanging in the back of the closet, she said. The one he wore to church. I hadn't looked in that part of the closet, and then I did, and there it was, and she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. I thought about the button in my breast pocket, didn't say it. It gets easier, I said, because that's what you say, and then I heard myself saying it and winced before I'd finished the sentence. Does it? She said. I don't know, I said. I keep waiting to find out. She almost smiled. Not quite, but the near thing, something moving at the corner of her mouth that, under different circumstances, would have become a smile. Thank you for not leaving, she said. I tried to leave, I said. I know. I watched you stand there for a full minute at the mouth of the alley. You saw that. I saw that. I rode home with the boots under my arm and my mind doing something I didn't fully trust. Working on a problem that wasn't the kind of problem I was supposed to be working on. I put Nora to bed and sat by the fire for a long time with a cup of coffee that went cold while I sat there and forgot to drink it. I thought about the $40. I thought about the south roof. I thought about the way Ruth Calder's hands looked when she was working, competent, quick, no wasted motion, and then told myself to stop thinking about Ruth Calder's hands, and then thought about them for another 5 minutes anyway, and then accepted that my mind was going where it was going to go. Here is the thing about the $40. I had been sitting on a problem that was $40, and she had been sitting on a problem that was $40. I had a ranch with good calves expected in the spring. She had acreage to the west of town that she couldn't fully work alone. If someone were to put those two problems in the same room and look at them with any clarity at all. I went to bed, got up twice in the night. Lay there the second time staring at the ceiling plank I'd never gotten around to replacing, the one with the crack running across it that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, and I thought about all the things I'd been meaning to do for 2 years and hadn't done, and I thought about a woman sitting on a crate in an alley, and I thought about a 6-year-old girl who already knew what a house was supposed to smell like and didn't have it. What I was circling and avoiding looking at directly was this, that I had been trying to save myself by staying very still, by not reaching for anything, not wanting anything, keeping myself at exactly the temperature that wouldn't crack. And it wasn't working, and it was never going to work, because staying very still was not the same as being all right. It was just a slow way of going under, and I had been going under for 2 years and calling it managing. The ceiling plank had the crack running across it. I lay there and looked at it until the first gray light came under the door. I went back to town on a Wednesday, midweek, nothing in particular requiring me to be there. I told myself I needed to check on a nail order that had been placed 3 weeks back. I told myself that. I found Ruth Calder at the schoolhouse, helping Mrs. Aldecoa repaper one of the walls where the moisture had gotten in. She was up on a step stool with a wide brush, smoothing paper flat against the wall with long, deliberate strokes, her back to the door. She was wearing an old work shirt, and her hair was partly pinned and partly not, and she hadn't heard me come in. I stood there for a moment. I didn't intend to stand there, watching her work, and there was something about the steadiness of it, the careful, patient focus of a woman doing a job because it needed doing, without looking for credit for it or performing the effort of it, that hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. I said her name. She looked over her shoulder, brush still in hand, a streak of paste on her wrist. Didn't look surprised. Didn't look like anything I could read immediately. "Mr. Greer," she said. Mrs. Aldecoa looked between us with the sharp attention of a woman who knew what was afoot well, before the participants had figured it out themselves. "I need to talk to you," I said, "when you have a moment." "Go," Mrs. Aldecoa said to Ruth, in the tone of a person issuing a direct order to someone she was pretty sure needed one. We went outside. The air was sharp and still, the sky that flat winter gray that could mean snow by evening or could mean nothing at all. We stood by the schoolhouse wall, both of us looking at the street for a moment rather than at each other, and I said what I'd thought through twice in the night and once on the ride in that morning, the thing I'd organized and reorganized until it was plain enough to actually say. "Your note," I said. "I know a man in Holbrook named James Prentice who does legal work. Contracts and property, mostly. He's handled work for me before, the deed on the creek pasture, a boundary dispute with a man to the east who decided my fence was in the wrong place. I think the provision your husband signed may not be enforceable the way the bank is claiming it is. I can't promise that. I'm not a lawyer and I don't know your papers, but I think it's worth Prentice looking at them." She was quiet for a moment, the sound of someone inside hammering something, probably Mrs. Aldecoa deciding the wall needed more than paper. "Why would you do that?" I didn't have a clean answer. What I had was, I had watched a capable woman sit in an alley on a crate and I had not been able to stop thinking about it, and I didn't like what that meant and I wasn't ready to say what it meant, but I could do this one practical thing that might actually help, and doing it required no declaration of anything. What I said was, "Because I know what it is to watch something you built start to come apart, and I know a man who might be able to help." She looked at the street. "Mr. Greer." "Emmett," I said. A pause. The quality of the pause was particular, a person registering the shift in what was being offered. "Emmett," she said, "I am not someone who takes charity well." "This isn't charity. Prentice charges $6 for a consultation. I'll advance the 6, and you pay me back in the spring when your cattle sell. 47 head. Then you can afford $6 in the spring." She thought about it. She was a person who thought things through, and you could see her doing it, not performing consideration but actually weighing it, which was another thing I noticed because it was not universal. "Why?" she said again, not hostile, honest. "And because I was tired of dancing around things and it was cold, and I'd made a decision on the ride in that if I was going to do anything I was going to do it honestly," I said. "Because my daughter thinks you'd be good to know, and I have begun to think she might not be wrong." I looked at the street after that. The back of my neck was warm. She was quiet for a long moment. I counted the planks on the front of the freight office, got to 7. $6, she said. $6. Spring repayment. Spring repayment. Another beat. "You should know," she said, "that I am also not someone who lets things like a south roof go unmentioned when I've noticed them." "I know," I said. "I've been given to understand that." "Just so we're clear on what you're agreeing to." "We're clear," I said. Prentice and Holbrook found a defect in the provision. Something to do with the date on the signature page not matching the recorded date at the county office, improperly witnessed, or the witness wasn't properly authorized. I still can't tell you exactly what it was. Legal work is one of those things that operates in a language I can follow but not speak. The upshot was the bank couldn't call the note in the way they'd claimed, and Ruth had until March to make the standard payment, which she could manage. She came out to the ranch the following Saturday to tell me. She didn't need to come out to the ranch. She could have left a note at the general store, or told me any of the 3 times we'd crossed paths in town in the intervening days, but she came out to the ranch. Nora saw the wagon coming up the track from the creek road and went very still in the way she did when she was managing her excitement, pressing it down with visible effort, trying to be dignified about it. I watched her do that from the window and felt something both tender and painful, that she'd already learned at 6 to manage her wanting, to not get ahead of things in case things didn't go the way she'd hoped. Where she'd learned it, I could guess. Ruth had brought, and I still don't entirely know why this one thing, out of everything, is what gets to me when I think back on it. She'd brought a pot of stew. Not as a gesture, not as an overture, as a thing she'd made because she'd made too much and it would go to waste otherwise, which is the most honest reason to bring a person food and also the most disarming one, because it doesn't ask for anything back. She set it on the stove and looked around my kitchen without judgment, though she didn't avoid seeing it for what it was either, which was a room that had everything it needed in a functional sense and nothing it needed in the other sense. A room that was doing its job without being a place. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they're figuring out, not with pity, and I found I could stand that. Nora said, "I can show you my drawings." Ruth said, "I would like that very much." They went into the back room. I stood in the kitchen with the smell of that stew filling the house, and I didn't move for a while. I put my hand on the back of a chair and I stood there and I let the smell be there, and I didn't make it into anything. Just let it be a warm smell in a cold month. Here is what December into January looks like when something has shifted, though you're not yet calling it shifted. She came twice more to the ranch on practical reasons. I went to her place on the west of town 3 times on practical reasons. The practical reasons were genuine. I'm not saying I invented them, but they could have been handled otherwise, and we both knew that, and neither of us said it. Nora had the quality of a child who has already said the obvious thing once and sees no particular need to repeat herself. She simply behaved, around Ruth, as though the matter were settled and she was just waiting for the adults to arrive at the same conclusion she'd already reached. This was either deeply embarrassing or deeply wise. I still haven't decided. We sat at dinner together 4 times between December and the New Year, once at her place and 3 times at mine, and each time was easier than the last, which should have alarmed me and didn't, which itself perhaps should have alarmed me. But I was past the capacity for alarm about it. I was just in it. She was funny. I hadn't anticipated that. Not in a performed way, not in the way some people are funny to set others at ease or to fill a silence, genuinely funny, dry, catching the ridiculous in things, and stating it plainly before you'd had time to formulate a response, so that you laughed from sheer relief at having the thing named. She had a story about a mule she tried to move across a creek in high water that she told at the table one night with such perfect flat delivery that I laughed until I had tears on my face, which felt strange. Not wrong, just strange. Like a muscle I'd let go unused for 2 years suddenly asked to work again. She'd grown up in this territory, knew it better than I did in some ways after all my years on it. Knew the ranchers you could trust and the ones to watch sideways, knew where the creek ran false in a wet spring, knew which limestone ridge gave the best shelter in a north wind. Knowledge that comes from childhood, from your bones, that you don't get any other way. She had opinions about how cattle should be managed in cold weather that differed from mine. She was right and I was wrong, which I discovered empirically over the following 2 months and eventually said out loud, and she received that without much satisfaction in it, which I respected. She had a way with Nora that was nothing like performance. She didn't soften or baby her, didn't do the thing adults sometimes do where they think being kind to a child means being slightly stupid around them. She talked to Nora like a person, like someone whose thoughts were worth listening to and responding to honestly. I watched Nora expand under that, the way a plant goes toward water, reaching toward it, and it was the most beautiful and most difficult thing I had seen in a very long time. Beautiful because my daughter deserved it. Difficult because I understood, watching it, how much she'd been missing and how long she'd been missing it. And I was the reason she'd been missing it, because I'd been in my chest-deep water too long to be fully present for her the way she needed. In January, she came to help with the south roof. I had finally started it myself. Picked a clear, cold day when the wind was down, got up there with the pry bar and a bag of new shingles, pulled 3 bad ones, and then stood looking at the extent of what actually needed doing and felt the particular despair of the man who opens a wall to fix one board and finds the rot goes further than he thought. I stood on that roof in the cold and looked at how much work there was, and I felt the water rise up around me again. Pete Haskell had appeared in my yard the next afternoon without a word about it, just climbed up the ladder and started pulling shingles, and I was too tired to argue with him and also too relieved, in the part of me I was trying not to listen to. An hour after that, Ruth's wagon came up the track. She climbed down with a bag of cut shingles she'd prepared herself, already the right size. And for a moment I stood in my own yard between these 2 people who had shown up without being asked, because of their own decision, because they'd decided I was worth showing up for, and I felt something I would need a while to find the word for. Not humility exactly, closer to being seen as a man who was struggling, who needed help, and having people show up for him anyway. Not because he'd asked, because they'd looked at the situation and made a choice. The 3 of us worked the roof for 4 hours in cold that worked its way into your hands no matter what you did. Haskell left it dark. Ruth and I finished the last ridge section by lantern light, her holding the light at the angle that put it on my work, me with the nail set. And there was nothing romantic about it. It was cold and my hands ached and we were both tired, but it was the best kind of tired, the kind that comes from a thing being done that needed doing. Nora had made supper while we worked, cornbread and the remainder of some beans she'd found. The cornbread was cooked and cut thick and irregular, the way everything is when a 6-year-old does it, and it was the best meal I ate that entire year. We sat at the table and Ruth picked up a piece of that cornbread and looked at it and said, "This is exactly how cornbread should look," and Nora glowed like something lit from inside. After dinner, after Nora was in bed, Ruth and I sat by the fire. We didn't talk much. I had found over those weeks that we could be quiet together without it meaning anything was wrong, without the quiet being something that needed filling. It was an unusual quality in a person, and I'd only known one other person who had it. I was watching the fire and not thinking much of anything when she said, quietly, "Thomas used to say I was too hard." I looked at her. Not cruel, just too direct, too willing to say the difficult thing when a softer person would have let it go. A pause. I never thought he was wrong about it, I just couldn't seem to change it. "Why would you change it?" She looked at me. "People say what they mean or they don't," I said. "The ones who don't are harder to trust." She looked at the fire for a while, then she said, "Your wife, what was she like?" I hadn't been asked this in a long time. People had stopped asking because they'd seen what it did to me, and they were kind, and they'd stopped. Ruth asked it plainly, looking at the fire rather than at me, giving me the option of looking at the fire too, rather than being looked at while I answered. "Steady," I said. She was steady in a way I never was. She was smarter than me and she knew it and she didn't rub it in, which was generous of her. She would have had that bank provision unwound herself before I'd figured out there was a problem. A pause. She laughed at things I didn't know I'd said until she laughed. I'd say something and she'd laugh and I'd realize I'd been funny without knowing it. I only found out I was funny because of her. Ruth was quiet. "Nora has her eyes," I said, "the exact same eyes." "I know," Ruth said. "I saw it the first day I met her, at the dry goods counter." We sat with that. "Thomas," she said after a while, "he was a good man. He worked hard and he didn't complain, which I respected. She stopped, chose different words. "We were companions," she said. "Good, honest companions. I miss him. I miss having a person in the house. I miss being known." A pause. "I don't think I knew how to tell him what I wanted him to know. We were always going to have more time. there would be an occasion for it. I knew about the always going to have more time. That stays with me, she said. Every day, the things I would say now if I could, the things I just let go by thinking there was no hurry. She looked at her hands in her lap. I suppose that's why Nora's question hit me the way it did. In the dry goods store, children don't wait. They don't decide something isn't the moment for it. They just say the thing. She frightens me sometimes, I said. That quality. She got it from somewhere, Ruth said. I looked at her. The corner of her mouth moved. I don't know you well enough to say that yet, she said. You know me well enough, I said. The fire went down a little. I put another piece of wood on. When I sat back down, she was looking at me with those dark, steady eyes, and I didn't look away from them. I am not the same man I was, I said. Before Ellie, I was lighter, more certain of things, better in a room with people. I don't know if I get back to that or if there's some version of it that's still available. I genuinely don't know. I don't think you're supposed to get it back, she said. I think you're supposed to be the man who came out the other side of what you came out of. That man is worth knowing. I held it in the place below words where things either land or they don't. You don't know me well enough to say that either, I said, but my voice was different when I said it. I know you well enough, she said, same words, giving them back to me. February came in hard and stayed hard through the middle of the month. There was a week when the temperature dropped low enough that I was out every night checking the cattle, walking the fence line in the dark with a lantern, the cold pressing through everything I wore. I'd come back in to find the fire tended. She was there, 3 nights out of 7, staying in the spare room. She didn't make anything of it. It was practical, weather like that. Having someone at the ranch who could keep Nora and the fire while I was out was practical. We both said that, and both believed it, and both knew it wasn't only that. The calves came in right. 23 strong, 21 of them selling well. I paid the bank in Hallbrook. Ruth sold cattle in March and came by the ranch and handed me $6 in coin, and I took it and put it in my coat pocket and went back to the fence I was mending. And 3 weeks later I found it there and laughed out loud, alone in the north pasture, which surprised me. The laughing. I want to tell you about one day in March. It was the kind of March day that's not spring yet but is making promises, cold still, serious cold, but the light changed, coming in lower and sharper and staying longer, and the ground was thinking about thawing in the parts of the afternoon that got the most sun. I was mending the north fence, the section along the cottonwoods. Ruth had come out to the ranch that morning to help me move the herd to the south pasture, and we'd done that already. And after midday she'd ridden out to where I was working and we'd fallen into it together. I'd pull staples and set new ones. She'd hold the wire taut on the stretcher. And it went quiet in the way work goes quiet when you stop thinking about the work and just do it. We were near the end of the line. The cottonwoods were still bare, they come late, but there was a quality to them in that light, the bark gray-silver, the shadows long on the winter grass. I was on my knees with the nail set, and she was holding the stretcher, and we hadn't talked in maybe 20 minutes. Then Nora came running from the house. Full tilt across the field, hair flying out behind her, at the speed she ran when something was important and she needed to cover ground immediately. I straightened. Ruth let the wire down. We both watched her come. But when she got to us, she wasn't upset. She'd found something was all, a hawk feather. A big one-tail feather, I thought, almost 12 inches, marked brown and cream and white. The kind of marking that makes you stop and look even if you've seen 100 of them. She held it up with both hands, out of breath, like she was presenting something to a court. "Look," she said. Ruth took it, turned it in the light, which is what you do with a feather like that, you turn it to see the way the colors change. Then she handed it back to Nora and said, "That's a red-tailed hawk. That's a lucky thing to find." Nora held it against her chest and looked at Ruth, and then she looked at me, and then she said, in the tone of a child clarifying a fact that seems to her to be obvious, "Is she going to stay, Papa?" I mean really stay. I looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at me. We haven't talked about it, I said. But you want to, Nora said. Nora, I said. You do though, she said, not arguing, stating. Ruth was looking at me with those dark eyes, and there was something in them, something that was amusement on the surface, and underneath it something that was asking a real question, and had been asking it for a while. And I had been living alongside that question for months, careful with it, being responsible about it, finding the sensible pace. And I was done with the sensible pace. I was tired of the sensible pace. Yes, I said, to Nora, to Ruth, to the north pasture and the bare cottonwoods and the winter light. I do. Nora nodded like a verdict had been properly handed down, and turned, and walked back to the house with the hawk feather held straight up, like a flag. Ruth and I stood in the north pasture, with the wire stretcher between us. That wasn't how I planned to, I started. When did you plan it? She said. Tonight, after she was in bed, I had something I was going to say. Say it, she said. I looked at the fence. I looked at the cottonwoods. I looked at her. I am not easy to be around, I said. I know that, and I am not apologizing for it because I don't know how to change it, but I want to say it plain. I go quiet for days at a time, and I don't always find my way back quickly. I have a daughter who says everything she thinks, and I can't decide if that's going to be a great gift to the world or a great affliction, and either way it's what she is. I have a ranch that is exactly as much work as it appears to be, and a south roof that we just fixed that will probably need attention again in 5 years. And I am not a man who has, I stopped, looked for the rest of it. I don't have a lot to offer, I said, which was not the planned speech but was the truer thing. The stone at the bottom. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped across the wire, both feet over it, and walked up to me and put both hands flat on my chest. Flat and steady. Looked up at me from close enough that I could see the gray at her temples and the particular set of her jaw. Emmett, she said, I need you to hear something. I waited. You have been surviving in this house for 2 years like a man who has decided survival is all he's allowed. I watched you spend $6 you didn't have on a problem you could have ignored. I watched you get up on that roof in the cold. I watched you walk your daughter to school every morning in the dark, 1 foot in front of the other every morning. I know what that is. I know what it costs. Her hands were warm through my coat. You are a good man. Not perfect and not easy, but good. You are a good father. You are the kind of man who walks into an alley when someone is sitting on a crate and you don't make a production of it. You just lean on the wall and stay. Do you understand how rare that is? In my whole life, I have met maybe 2 people who do that. 2. My throat was wrong. I didn't say anything. I know what I'm saying yes to, she said. I've known for a while. I'm saying yes to the quiet days and the difficult nights and the roof that'll need work in 5 years. I'm saying yes to the girl who says everything she thinks, which I love. I genuinely love it. I want you to know that. I'm saying yes to all of it, to you. Her hands pressed harder, just slightly. Are you going to say something? I had a speech, I said. My voice came out rough. I know you mentioned. It was organized. I'm sure it was. The corner of her mouth. Give it to me later. I put my hands over hers. Both of them, all 4 hands layered there, pressing her palms against my chest. We stood in the north pasture in the March light, the cottonwoods behind her, the sky going that pale gold it goes late in the afternoon, and I could feel my own heartbeat under our hands, and it was enough. It was the whole thing. We were married in April. The freight office schoolhouse that doubled as a church when the circuit preacher came through. 8 people in the room plus Mrs. Aldecoa weeping into her handkerchief in the way she wept at everything, including, legend had it, the hatching of a particularly large calf. Nora stood between us at the front with the hawk feather braided into her hair, which she had asked Mrs. Aldecoa about and which Mrs. Aldecoa had agreed to with no conditions, and which the circuit preacher looked at once and decided, wisely, to make no remark about. Ruth wore a dark blue dress I hadn't seen before. She'd made it over the winter, she told me later in the evenings. She'd been making it for a while. The preacher said the words and we said the words back, and Haskell shook my hand so hard I lost feeling in my fingers for 5 minutes, and his wife cried, and Mrs. Aldecoa cried, and Nora stood between us very straight and very solemn through the whole thing. And then when it was done she looked up at Ruth and said, "So now you're staying?" And Ruth said, "So now I'm staying." And that was that. The first week we were married I kept waking up in the night and lying there for a moment before I remembered, the way you do when something has changed and your sleeping mind hasn't caught up to it yet. And then I'd remember, and the remembering was not a small thing. It was the particular weight of something that had been missing so long you'd reorganized yourself around the absence, suddenly present again. Not the same weight as before, a different shape. But weight, real and warm, and her breathing there in the dark beside me, and the house outside, and the cattle in the field, and Nora asleep in her room, and the hawk feather in its jar on the parlor shelf. I want to be honest about what came after, because I'm not in the business of telling you a story where love comes in and solves things. It doesn't solve things. The water doesn't go away. You just have someone in it with you, and that changes what the water is. I still went quiet sometimes for too long, sometimes for days, going into myself and not finding the door back out right away. Ruth would wait it out, not always patiently. She was not a patient person precisely. She was a direct person, and sometimes being direct and being patient are the same thing and sometimes they aren't. But she would wait. Sometimes she'd just come and stand near me and not say anything, and that was enough. And sometimes she'd say something direct and a little uncomfortable, which was also sometimes exactly what was needed. There were nights she wept for Thomas, quietly in the dark when she thought I was asleep. I was rarely asleep. I would lie there and not say anything and eventually put a hand on her back and she would go still, and that was its own kind of conversation, one that didn't need words. We had learned, both of us, about the things that don't need words. Nora broke her wrist falling out of a cottonwood that summer, the same cottonwoods on the north fence. She'd climbed up after a hawk and come down faster than she'd planned. I carried her in and Ruth set the wrist. She'd learned from her grandmother, she told me, who'd had the hands for it. And Nora was furious the entire time because she was in pain, and furious was how she handled pain. But after Ruth was done and the splint was bound, Nora grabbed Ruth's hand with her good hand and held it, and Ruth held it back, and nobody said anything about it, and that was its own whole thing. I want to tell you about one night that first summer, a night in July. I'd been out late moving cattle to the east pasture, a job that had taken longer than it should because one of the steers had decided that the east pasture was not where he intended to go, and I'd been having an argument with him about it for the better part of 2 hours. I came back to the house after full dark, tired in the bone-deep way, hands smelling of horse and dirt, and when I pushed the door open, this is what I saw. The lamp was on at the table. Ruth was sitting there writing a letter, her back to me, just the lamp and the quiet and her bent over the paper with that deliberate hand of hers. Nora was already asleep. The fire was down, but there was still warmth in the room, and it smelled like the supper she'd kept warm for me on the back of the stove, and she hadn't heard me come in. I stood in the doorway of my own house, for a moment that I let last as long as it needed to last. I thought about all the nights I'd come through that door into cold and dark, and the smell of leather and smoke. I thought about what it had cost me to do that, night after night, to push through that door into that nothing and cook something and put Nora to bed and sit by the fire by myself, and then do it again the next day. I'd done it because there was no other option, because you do what you have to do, and I'd thought that was enough. I'd thought you could survive on having no choice about it. You can survive on that. I had proved it. But survival is not the same as living, and I had been not living for 2 years and calling it getting through. Then she heard me, turned, looked at me in the doorway with the lamplight on her face and those dark eyes and said, "You look like you've been out in the dark too long." Little bit, I said. Food's on the stove, she said. Come in and shut the door. I came in, I shut the door. Nora is 28 years old now. She married a man who builds rail bridges, which seems exactly right for a person who has always wanted to get from where she is to somewhere further. They have 2 children. She still says everything she thinks. This has turned out to be, as I predicted, both a gift and an affliction, depending on the day and who's on the receiving end. Ruth has silver in her hair all the way through now, not just the temples. I said something about it once and she told me to stop, that it was vain to be pleased by something you couldn't help. I said there were worse things. She gave me that look she has, the particular look that is the last word in any argument whether she says anything else or not. I still have the button. It's in the breast pocket of my good shirt, the same one Ellie sewed it onto all those years ago. The shirt has been let out twice and it's softer now than it started, soft as cloth gets when it's been worn and washed enough times. The button is horn, small, brown, nothing much to look at. It came from love. The first kind, the kind that made Nora and made what I am, the kind that showed me what a house was supposed to feel like. Love doesn't get replaced by love. That's the thing I would say to anyone who needed to hear it. It gets added to. The shape of you changes, makes room, and you carry all of it forward, all the weight of every person who ever mattered, and the weight is not a burden. It's everything that made you. The button is there in the pocket. The hawk feather is in a jar on the parlor shelf, where Nora put it when she was 6, and where it has stayed. The south roof holds,